April 12, 1945. Ohrdruf, Germany. Generals Eisenhower, Patton, and Bradley had just finished touring the first concentration camp liberated by American forces. They had been inside for 2 hours. Eisenhower came out and stood in the road. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "We are told the American soldier does not know what he is fighting for. Now, at least, we know what he is fighting against." Patton had vomited inside one of the barracks. He refused to enter a second building, a shed with 30 bodies sprinkled with lime to mask the smell, because he was afraid he would be sick again. Bradley said nothing for hours afterward. 3 of the most senior military commanders in the world had just seen something that made one of them physically ill, one of them go silent, and one of them stand in a road looking for words that didn't exist. What they did next was not in any military manual. The town of Ohrdruf was less than 2 miles from the camp. It had been there the whole time. Population of several thousand. Ordinary German citizens, farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, families. They had lived 2 miles from a place where men were worked to death, where bodies were stacked, where prisoners were shot during a death march in the final days because the SS didn't want witnesses walking into American hands. Patton ordered the townspeople brought to the camp. Not requested, ordered, under military authority enforced by armed soldiers. They were told to dress in their best clothes, not as a sign of respect for the dead, but because Patton wanted them to have no excuse, no physical discomfort to use as a distraction from what they were about to see. Over 1,200 men and women from Ohrdruf walked through those gates. The U.S. Army Operations Report from April 4th, written by soldiers who had been in combat for years, said, "Battle-hardened veterans who had seen death many times before gazed silently at the Nazi slaughterhouse. Some cried. Death on the battlefield was something they were able to comprehend. But this premeditated, brutish murder was beyond their imagination." That was soldiers writing about what soldiers saw. The civilians of Ohrdruf were not soldiers. They had not spent years in combat. They had no framework at all for what they walked into. The bodies were still there. The instruments of torture were still laid out. The execution posts, the mass grave at the edge of the camp, the evidence of what systematic murder looked like when it was applied to human beings over months and years. The American guides did not let them look away. What the townspeople said as they walked through was a version of the same thing, over and over. "Wir haben es nicht gewusst." We didn't know. The American officers heard this answer dozens of times that day. They did not argue with it. They did not accept it either. They simply kept walking the Germans through the camp, room by room, building by building, letting what was there speak for itself. Some Germans wept. Some stood in silence. Some had to be physically prevented from turning back toward the gates. One woman fainted near the crematorium and was helped to her feet by an American soldier, who then walked her forward to continue the tour. That evening, the mayor of Ohrdruf and his wife went home. What they did next was recorded by American officers and confirmed in multiple post-war accounts. They hanged themselves. They left a note. 4 words in German, preserved in the historical record. Wir wussten es nicht, aber wir wussten es. We didn't know, but we knew. That note is the center of everything that happened at Ohrdruf on April 12th. Not the tour, not the order, not Patton's decision to force 1,200 people through those gates. 4 words that a German mayor and his wife chose as their final statement to the world and to themselves. We didn't know, but we knew. What did they know? This is the question historians have been trying to answer for 80 years. Not just about the mayor of Ohrdruf, but about every German civilian who lived within distance of a camp, who smelled the smoke, who saw the prisoners in striped uniforms being marched through streets, who heard the stories that circulated through every community in Germany throughout the 12 years of Nazi rule. The Ohrdruf camp had been established in November 1944. It was 5 months old when Americans arrived. In those 5 months, around 20,000 prisoners passed through. They were worked on construction tunnels beneath a nearby castle, tunnels meant to serve as an emergency shelter for Hitler's command train if Berlin fell. The prisoners came from Buchenwald. They marched through the surrounding area to reach the worksite. They were visible. Their condition was visible. The town was 2 miles away. Eisenhower understood the problem clearly. He had already decided, before the Ohrdruf tour, that documentation was essential, that the day would come when people would deny what had happened, and that the evidence needed to be overwhelming. He cabled Washington and London within hours of leaving the camp, requesting that newspaper editors and members of Congress be flown to Germany immediately. Not in weeks, immediately. His message was explicit. I want you to see for yourself what kind of enemy we are fighting and what he did to his prisoners. Within days, delegations of U.S. senators, British MPs, and newspaper editors were being escorted through Buchenwald, Nordhausen, and Dachau. What they saw is in the historical record. What several of them said publicly upon returning helped build the framework of understanding that eventually led to the Nuremberg trials. The practice of forcing German civilians to witness the camps spread across the Western Front. At Weimar, 2 miles from Buchenwald, over 1,000 German civilians were brought through the camp. American soldiers stood nearby. At Buchenwald itself, 200 German men were ordered to dig mass graves, disinter decomposed bodies, and rebury them at the top of the hill overlooking the camp. An American officer recorded one exchange. The Germans complained about the heat, the smell. The officer's response was brief. Dig, you sons of bitches. At camps throughout Bavaria and Thuringia, the pattern repeated. American commanders ordered local populations to come see, to witness, to understand that proximity was not the same as innocence. Some Germans, confronted with what they saw, said they felt shame. Others insisted they truly had not known. Some cooperated fully, clearly shaken. Others showed what witnesses described as minimal emotional response. Faces that had seen too much propaganda, too many years of state control, to process what they were seeing in a single afternoon. Whether the tours changed anything, whether witnessing created accountability or remorse, or simply the performance of remorse, is a question the historical record cannot fully resolve. Patton's reasoning, as he expressed it in letters and conversations with staff during this period, was less philosophical than Eisenhower's. Eisenhower thought about legacy, about history, about the record that needed to exist for future generations. Patton thought about the people standing in front of him. He had ordered the Ohrdruf townspeople brought to the camp in part because of specific intelligence. Local farmers had been using the camp's outbuildings for storage. They had been inside the perimeter. They had seen what was there. The claim of total ignorance was, in those cases, simply not credible. But Patton also understood something broader. that the machinery of genocide does not operate in a vacuum, that it requires infrastructure, labor, transportation, supply chains, administrative support, that it takes place in a society, not outside of one. Forcing civilians to stand in that society's product was not, for Patton, an act of cruelty. It was an act of insisting on reality. The note left by the mayor of Ohrdruf, those 4 words, became one of the most quoted documents from the liberation period. We didn't know, but we knew. Historians have used it as a kind of shorthand for the broader question of German civilian complicity. The distinction between active participation, passive knowledge, and the deliberate choice not to know something that the evidence suggested was true. The mayor and his wife had lived 2 miles from the camp for 5 months. They had been brought through the gates by American soldiers and seen what was inside. Then they went home and wrote 4 words that admitted everything their previous denial had denied. They didn't survive the night. What Patton, Eisenhower, and Bradley did at Ohrdruf, and what American commanders did at camps across Germany in those weeks, established a precedent that shaped how the world handled accountability after the war. The Nuremberg trials began 6 months later. The legal framework they applied, command responsibility, crimes against humanity, the argument that following orders is not a defense when the orders require the participation in mass murder, grew directly from what Allied investigators documented in those camps in April and May of 1945. The forced tours were part of that documentation, not as legal evidence, but as moral evidence, as proof that the knowledge existed, that proximity was not coincidence, that a country cannot build something on this scale in the middle of its own territory and then claim the entire population was unaware. The mayor of Ohrdruf disagreed with that claim. His note said so. April 12, 1945. Patton stood at Ohrdruf and was sick. Bradley went quiet. Eisenhower looked for words. 2 miles away, in a town that had existed next to what they were looking at for 5 months, a man and woman went home that evening, sat down, and wrote, "We didn't know." Then they wrote the second sentence, "But we knew." Then they were gone.